page, where you can already find the recordings of our previous lectures. You are probably well aware, but Israel is once again at war, and we send our best to all those in Israel and across the Middle East, and we hope for better days, for peace, health, and safety for everyone. And we also send our warm congratulations to our colleague Shachar on the birth of her child earlier this week, and wish her and her family all the very best. So, Mazal Tov, Shachar. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Johannes Heil from the Heidelberg University of Jewish Studies. Professor Heil is the Ignaz Bubitz Endowed Chair of Religion, History, and Culture of European Judaism at the Heidelberg University of Jewish Studies, where he previously served as a rector. He specializes in Jewish history from late antiquity to the early modern period, with particular emphasis on the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages and the transmission of Jewish texts within Christian culture. His wide-ranging research has significantly contributed to our understanding of the intellectual, religious, and cultural history of European Jewry, including historiography, medieval textual traditions, and the dynamics of interreligious encounter. His work also engages critically with the history of anti-Semitism and the formation of historical narratives about Jews and Judaism in Europe. Among his many publications are Gottes Finde, Menschenfinde from 2006, From Theodulf to Rashi and Beyond from 2022, as well as numerous edited volumes and essays on medieval Jewish history, Jewish-Christian relations, and the historiography of anti-Semitism. His latest book, Andere Juden, Texte der westlichen Diaspora und ihre christliche Rezeption, was published in 2024. And this is a warm recommendation, if I may, for this comprehensive pioneering work that really reconstructs our understanding of Jewish intellectual activity in the early medieval West. Today, Professor Heil will discuss the Philo-Filter at work, how Jewish Latin texts survived and why they survived in Christian libraries only. We will take questions after the lecture, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand or put your name or question in the chat. And now, without further ado, Professor Heil, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oz, for this very kind introduction, and all of you for organizing and inviting me to speak to you this early evening on issues of my latest research. And I hope you can hear me well. Please give me a sign if there is some problem with loudness or if my English is not my native tongue. So maybe if something is not understandable, please just interrupt me and I will try to explain better. So and as English is not my mother tongue, so please forgive me that I'm speaking from the manuscript, but I hope it will be anyway a little bit lively and also entertaining in an academic sense. And I'm starting with the fact that the posthumous careers of the most important known Jewish authors of the first century, Philo and Josephus, are well documented. Philo was patronized by Jerome practically as an honorary church father, honoris causa, while Josephus among Christians was no less recognized as a meticulous chronicler of events in the time of Jesus, and thus, moreover, as a key witness to salvation history, at least in the sense as the Church wished to understand it. The posthumous lives of such Jewish authors do indeed present themselves as entirely Christian careers. Explicit Jewish traces of Philo and other representatives of Greco-Judaism seem to be absent in the Jewish textual tradition after the 2nd century CE. Josephus' Jewish material survives in the Sefer Yosipon, but this continuation is likely a product of the 10th century or only a little bit earlier, as Geniza fragments have shown. A genuine engagement with Philo's person and work is only discernible on the Jewish side in the 16th century, and then the Alexandrian appeared like the well-known uncle from America. Genealogically related, perhaps, but anyway a somewhat eccentric person. Asaria di Rossi, he lived from 1511 to 78, a scholar from Mantua, you may know, strove to liberate Philo from his serfdom for the Christians and to restore him as a Jewish author and thinker. However, Philo's Greek thought and the Jewish intellectual and social world shaped within it remained largely incomprehensible to the early modern Jewish humanist. It hardly meshed with the long-standing rabbinic modes of thought of his own Jewish tradition and with his project of integrating Jewish rabbinic traditions into the intellectual world of humanism. Centuries earlier, Jerome had called Philo the most distinguished scholar of the Jews, Philo vir doctissimus Judaeorum. Why Philo so easily integrated himself into Christian thought, especially as a treasure trove for clauses on the Gospel of John and on Paul, has already been extensively discussed, and what hasn't said on the subject can safely be left to others, especially to theologians. Historians are sometimes less interested in the texts themselves than in their impact. I take the advantage to focus rather on the significance of the afterlife of Jewish authors and their works within Christian career paths, less onto the content on such texts. And this is where what can be described as the Philo-Filter comes into play. That works from the Second Temple period or later that were not written in Hebrew script had virtually no chance of preservation and transmission within the Jewish communities as the new millennium progressed, because the spread of rabbinic Judaism from east to west and the Hebraization of Jewish culture, so to say, palimpsested everything that had previously been dominant. In contrast, this older Jewish text culture was absorbed by Christian tradition, and in the process much may have been excluded that was irrelevant from a Christian perspective, or perhaps considered offensive in view of Christian dogmata. What is then my plan today? After this introduction, I will, as a cross-section through my recent work, address Yavne Pella and the parting of the ways. The next step will be the relationship between language and religion. Then I will check the medieval evidence for the Jewish biographies of authors. I will discuss the ignorance of modern historians. And finally, I will speak about old texts, new approaches, and different conclusions. Basically, one should move beyond the rather simple observation that the Jews Philo and Josephus owe the transmission of their works insofar as it can be ascertained to Christian recipients. And one may refrain from pursuing the question of whether the Christian adaptation, the reception, was an unprecedented appropriation or, on the contrary, a stroke of luck for the survival of the works of the Jewish authors. This proves to be not only a futile but, in fact, a fundamentally flawed question. For by projecting the later evident religious and cultural contrast and the borders between hegemonic Christianities and marginalized Jewish communities back onto the conditions of the 2nd to 4th or even 6th centuries, it leads us
Professor Heil,
heuristic. Yeah,
we lost the
I
screen.
I see.
So maybe you
Um,
can share it again.
yeah, just let me finish the sentence.
Yeah,
The sentence
sorry about it.
leads us into a blind spot, obscuring fruitful perspective, to which I will return when the presentation is here again. I don't know why it moved away. I hope you see it again.
Yeah, we do.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay. So I undertake a reversal of perspectives. Philo and Josephus should not be considered reluctant adopted sons of Christian literary production. It seems more coherent not to decouple Christian works from their environment, but rather to understand them as a part of the general literary production of late antiquity. And this includes both classical and Jewish authors. To clarify what I mean here, let us consider Jerome. Like Augustine, Cassiodor, or Venantius Fortunatus, only to mention a few, Jerome can be called a Christian author who occasionally consulted Jewish interpreters and texts. At the same time, despite the eccentricity of his ascetic later lifestyle, he can also be understood as an author who was shaped by classical thought and who then moved within a linguistically and medially open space, utilizing readily available resources to write texts for a primarily Christian audience. Some of Jerome's works, such as the Questiones Hebraicae on the Book of Genesis, even contain so little explicitly Christian content that one can well imagine them occasionally being read by Jewish and other readers as well. One might say that such distinctions were mere nuances. However, they appear essential for the question of the conditions under which Jewish texts were transmitted within the Christian realm, because they allow us to argue that the Philo-Filter should not be understood as a liminal transgression, but rather as a visible outflow from the linguistically and medially open space of late antique education and literary production. This space must be freed from the ideological trappings added later and made visible again in its original form. The reasons for insisting on this heuristic distinctiones are less easily illustrated by the examples of Philo and Josephus, whose personalities, though occasionally interpolated or otherwise distorted, have remained recognizable in the tradition, in the Christian tradition. In Christian reception, Philo and Josephus have remained Jews. Narratives that sought to attribute conversion to Christianity to them, or even to elevate Josephus to the rank of a bishop of Jerusalem, have not prevailed. The situation is different with texts that were likely written by other Jews and were readable not only by Jews but also by others, and which have survived solely because later scribes in monastic and episcopal scriptoria, as we can trace them from the late 8th century onward, deemed such texts worthy of copying. They were cited from the 9th century onward, even up to the Glossa Ordinaria. They were cited by Alcuin, by Rabanus, by Haimo of Auxerre, by Angelomus, and others. I will return to this. But, and this is the crucial difference, in difference to Philo and Josephus, their authorship suffered as a result to the point of being unrecognizable or overwritten with other attributions. Given this, Philo and Josephus were by no means merely Jewish outsiders in Christian scriptoria, but prominent exponents of a much broader but anonymous flow of tradition. However, some preliminary remarks are necessary to address this, and I come to the part Yavne Pella and the parting of the ways. Hardly anyone today would still tell the story of the move from contested Jerusalem to the safer space Yavne, the rabbis, or the flight from Jerusalem to Pella, the Christians. Neither Rabbinic Judaism nor Christianity arose directly from the ruins of the temple, we know. Yavne and Pella have proven to be narrative constructs that, from the distance of 2 or more centuries, name an origin while simultaneously attempting to level the complexity of historical developments. The separation of the past between Judaism and Christianity, or rather Christianities in the plural, as has become clear in the recent decades, occurred gradually or perhaps never fully concluded. In The Ways That Never Parted, Annette Yoshika Reed and Adam H. Becker speak even only of, quote, different biblically based religious groups, which were as unstable in their structure as they were ideologically defined, and to which the efforts of standardizing actors were directed, to put it simply, rabbis here and church councils there. The transitional zones in the interaction between Jews and Christians, however, persist already. Religiously based groups, as Reed and Becker put it, persisted longer and were far more complex than they appear in retrospect. That, in a nutshell, is the long story. Church history, medieval textual history, or Jewish studies that focus solely on their own disciplines then define epistemic zones that appear consistent according to modern divisions between faculties and disciplines, but prove historically inconsistent and incomplete. What is needed are approaches that are open and cross-disciplinary, even intersectional. The consequences of these insights have by no means been universally applied. Even in a 2020 companion to Late Ancient Jews and Judaism by Kessler and Colton Fromm, the Second Temple period is followed immediately and exclusively by Rabbinic Judaism, the chapter on Rabbinic Judaism. No tertium, no third in between, not to speak about the various tertia, are considered. The next point on the relationship between language and religion. Here, a serious misunderstanding must be addressed. If one understands Jewish texts to be exclusively those written in Hebrew script, then one will find indeed no such texts in the West before the 8th and 9th century. At best, one might still recognize Greek texts and language practices there for a considerable time after Philo. A dissertation published in 2021 even speaks of, quote, a self-evident monolingualism of Greek among Western Jews. The epigraphic evidence, however, as you can see here in examples from the catacombs in the Vigna Randanini in Rome, tells a remarkably different story, and I could present you hundreds of these photos. In epigraphic testimonies in Rome, it is indeed predominantly Greek, but by no means exclusively, and hardly ever Hebrew. While elsewhere in Italy, and especially North Africa, apart from bilingual and trilingual inscriptions, and these often in hybrid forms, it is predominantly in Latin. This applies to the burial inscriptions from catacombs or also to the inscription of the synagogue of Naro Hamamlif in Tunisia, which can be dated to the 4th to 6th centuries, including most probably the memoria of the woman Juliana who donated the floor. And I have tried to give a transcription the interpretation of the P after the name of Juliana in the third line as presbytera may be something for discussion, but the alternatives, Ptolemais or Puella, to read the P after Juliana, it's the third letter in the third line, are even less convincing. Such examples reveal a completely different Judaism, one that was deeply embedded culturally in its surroundings and yet maintained its distinctiveness, in particular, not simply being absorbed into the church. The dimensions of the synagogues in the port cities of Ostia, near Rome, Bova Marina in Calabria, or on the Tunisian coast in Hamamlif and Kelibia, and you have a picture of a reconstruction or a painting of the full floor in Hammam Liv, which is lost in its situation there today, and the parts are divided over different museums between New York and Tunis. The dimensions of such synagogues in these cities demonstrate a remarkably self-confident Judaism in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. The Jews who gathered in these synagogues were by no means only biblical Jews, as is sometimes assumed, and they likely possessed and knew much more than just the Bible scroll. This is initially a conjecture, but it is indirectly confirmed by the inscriptional evidence concerning institutions of teaching and instruction among Western Jews. Such indications are provided by frequently occurring terms like grammateus, didaskalus, didaskalos, and others. In addition, there are Christian accounts of Jewish teachers of the law, doctores legis, in texts by, for example, Severus of Minorca and Julian of Toledo. Then one might ask what the subject matter of this instruction was, solely Torah or also other texts. The assumption that it involved far more than just Torah or Bible, but that it was not Mishnah, what those teachers in Spain taught, as some argued, is supported by a number of texts that have survived only in Christian tradition but contain no Christian content whatsoever, and therefore can be of Jewish origin. Of course, the mere surface alone of these texts is not sufficient to claim Jewish authorship for a not insignificant number of such texts. Before presenting them, it is therefore worthwhile to examine how such texts were categorized by Christian authors in the 9th century. So I switch to the medieval evidence. In his dedicatory letters to Archchaplain Hilduin of Saint-Denis and most prominently to King Louis II, called the German, Abbot Rabanus Maurus of Fulda, when sending out his commentaries on the books of Kings and Chronicles around 830, openly stated that he had consulted text by an unknown Jew of our time, not insignificantly knowledgeable in the Torah. Hebreus quita moderni temporis in leges scientia non ignobiliter eruditus. These texts are the Questiones in Libros Regum et Paralipomenon of the so-called Pseudo-Jerome, which, according to the editions by Jean Martinet and Domenico Valarsi, are printed in the volume 23 of the Patrologia Latina series. This text survives in over 60 manuscripts prior to the 13th century between Monte Cassino and northern England. I have not checked later manuscripts. I went only up to the 13th century. The oldest, so textually rather poor, dates from the last quarter of the 8th century and is preserved in the chapter library of Verona Cathedral. Two of manuscripts of these questiones compiled in the 9th century in Reims and Saint-Denis. They are very much interrelated, and there is a discussion which one is the earlier one. I would suggest the Reims manuscript is the earlier one, and the Saint-Denis is sort of a copy of the Reims manuscript, but this is another discussion. So these two manuscripts already attributed the text to a Jewish author through their titles. Regarding the books of Chronicles, it states, here begins the interpretation of the Chronicles according to Jewish tradition, where the reader must be cautious. Ubi lector cautus esse debet. This reservation is explained by the title of the preceding commentary on the Book of Kings, presumably by the same author, or Book of Kings in the sense of the Vulgate. This is on Samuel 1. So there the title is, the interested reader should examine whether the Jew who interpreted the aforementioned book thus deviates from church doctrine in certain interpretations. In aliquibus discordat sententiis. These introductions warrant closer examination. Firstly, a clear reservation toward the author is evident, far more so in the manuscripts from Reims and Saint-Denis than in Rabanus' letters to the chaplain and the king. Secondly, these reservations apparently posed no obstacle to incorporating the Jewish questiones into ecclesiastical libraries and Christian texts. This may have been due to the lack of suitable paternal texts for interpreting the biblical historical books, which appeared of paramount importance to the Frankish king's sacral and political self-understanding. The abundance of etymological interpretations and the simplicity of the text's language, thus making it well suited for teaching purposes, likely also contributed to its acceptance. More the text itself than the author, who was only named as a Jew in these few examples from the ninth century, otherwise remaining anonymous and later becoming known as Jerome. So or so, the Jewish text was copied and thus ecclesiastically approved. What remains uncommented upon, and this should be emphasized, is the fact in Urbanus' works, as in the aforementioned ninth century manuscripts, that these were Jewish texts written in Latin script. This seems to have been self-evident to them in the ninth century. At least they raised no questions about the origin, the how, or the why, the very questions that inevitably arise today. The authors of the Carolingian era even felt no need to ask for which audience at all Jews wrote Latin texts. Since the 11th century, first in a codex probably of Lorraine origin, which you have here in the background, and I have seen it in original in the State Library in Munich, but the Dutch digitalized version is only from the microfilm, and the microfilm is bad. But you can see Super Regum Beati Hieronymi, and then comes the incipit Fuit vir unus deramatim, and this is the Pseudo Jerome text. So attributed to Hieronymus Jerome. Yeah. So in this codex of East French Lorraine origin, preserved from Freising in the State Library in Munich, and then in the Conquest Codex preserved in Durham, likely of Northern French origin, and many more times thereafter, these commentaries have been attributed to Jerome, sometimes directly by means of explicit titles, sometimes indirectly, as in the 11th century in the codices from Monte Cassino and Echternach, namely by being added to other texts of the Church Father Jerome or those attributed to him. This, I call it Hieronymization of, or Jeromization of Jewish Latin texts, was also promoted by the fact that, unlike the manuscripts from the 8th to 10th centuries, the text was now labeled as questiones, as questions, so it has no dialogic character whatsoever. However, it now formally resembled Jerome's questiones on Genesis, which in these codices had usually been placed at the beginning of the 11th century. And I have here for you the first page with the questiones of Jerome from that wonderful Durham Codex, which is online accessible as like only a few of the British manuscripts. As a result, the Philo-Filter endowed a Jewish text with the authority of the Church Father and secured it a place in the corpus of text that was then suitable for accommodating even more vagrants of uncertain origin, that is, smaller texts of partly Jewish origin. This can be called an act of colonization. However, the attribution of the Jewish commentaries to Jerome is more readily explained by the need to preserve a important text that not least had to withstand growing anti-Jewish sentiments if it was to remain in Christian use. One need only consider the anti-Jewish activities carried out by the Archbishops Agobard and Amulo of Lyon and their deacon, their assistant Florus, in the second quarter of the ninth century. The nonchalance with which Rabanus had introduced his Jewish author in the 830s could not hold up during later decades. The titles of the codices of Reims and Saint-Denis, formulated some time later, are already noticeably more reserved than Rabanus in his letters to Hilduin and the king. And Angelomus of Luxeuil, who presented another commentary on the Book of Kings a generation after Rabanus, was clearly trying to conceal the influence or the existence of the Jewish source on his work, when always saying the Hebrews have, the Hebrews say, Hebräi habend, but not calling it a book or a Jewish author, but just ascribing it in the way of Jerome to Jewish traditions. But it's clearly from the Questiones. So I turn as the fourth point to the ignorance of modern historians. The question of authorship of the Questiones on the biblical history books was clarified around 1700 already by the Maurists Jean Matianet and Antoine Puget, as well as the Veronese priest Domenica Valarsi mentioned already, who lived 1702 to 1771. Matianet and Puget 2 generations earlier. Contrary to Erasmus' assertion, they identified the author of the Questiones on the biblical history books and other texts with the Hebrew known by Rabanus and concluded that this author was an unknown Jew who had preceded Rabanus in life and that his texts have nothing to do with Jerome. Certa ab Hieronymo tantum hic differt Hebreus quantum differt a Margarita preciosissima vitrum aut orichalcum. A wonderful image which Matianet here developed. Giovanni Luigi Mignarelli and Giovanni Cristoforo Trombelli, in their 1751 edition of the Veterum Patrum Latinorum Opuscula, so something aside Valarsi, the texts he had overseen, they collected in a smaller series of books, I think it's in the 5th volume, cautiously concurred with this view when publishing further texts which they, probably rightly, attributed to the same authorship for stylistic reasons to Pseudo-Jerome. They stated that, quote, if we are not mistaken, he, the author, was of Hebrew nation and religion, but then that in his handling of the Bible he roughly followed our Vulgate. More recent scholars, however, have not been willing to accept these insights of the 17th, early 18th century. Moritz Abraham Rahmer, he lived from 1837 to 1904, challenged Matianet's description and remarked, this much can be stated with certainty, that the Questiones Hebraicae in the form available to us are only in content the work of a Hebrew, while the presentation belongs to a non-Jew. Louis Ginsberg, 1873 to 1953, in his Heidelberg dissertation on the Agadah bei den Kirchenvätern, the Agadah among the Church Fathers, was also visibly uneasy with the thought of a Jew writing in Latin. Far more so than the Maurists and Italian late humanists, Rahmer and Ginsberg thought in terms of a strict social and cultural segregation and could not imagine a Jew writing in Latin. The author of the Questiones appeared to them at best as a semi-educated Jew, or better yet, as a Christian with a Jewish teacher or a Jewish convert or whatever, who had only a rudimentary understanding of the Aggadic traditions. In the end, their negative judgment of the author's intellectual capacity was based on the fact that they simply could not imagine a Jewish intellectual without rabbinical training and familiarity with Aggadic traditions, thus applying standards of the text that were fundamentally inappropriate. What is remarkable then is how Johann Baptist Hablitzel, the Catholic Church historian and Rabanus expert active in the beginning of the 20th century, used representatives of Jewish studies, Rahmer and Ginsberg, who otherwise were rarely consulted in his circles, as key witnesses. He simply removed Rabban's Hebrew from his account, citing Ginsberg, and declared blatantly violating the literal meaning of Rabbanus' dedicatory letter to the chaplain and the king, that the abbot of Fulda had the questions of an unknown Christian author before him, as he himself writes to the archchaplain Hilduin. eines unbekannten christlichen Verfassers handschriftlich Rabanus vorgelegen haben, wie er selbst den Erzkaplan Hilduin schreibt. So this is the version Haplitzel makes from the context. And you see at the other side what Rabanus had, Hebreus quita moderni temporis in leges scientia non ignobilita eruditus. He clearly says he is a Hebreus. Yeah. Why he doesn't write he is a Jew, as the manuscripts von Rase and Saint-Denis may still be something for our discussion following the lecture. The filtering process, in which the Jewish author was once again forced into the corset of a Christian, or at least a convert's biography, culminated in Avram Saltman's 1975 edition of the Questiones on the Books of Samuel. Aside from the fact that Saltman could only rely on the four oldest known manuscripts, oldest known to him from the 9th century at the time, this is the Reims de Saint-Denis, Orléans, and St. Gallen, thus presenting a text that was repeatedly corrupt and inferior to that found in the 11th and 12th century manuscripts from Durham, Echternach, or Monte Cassino, as well as the quotations in Rabanus Maurus, indeed inferior to the text in Minni's Patrologia Latina. Saltman focused on supposed shortcomings of the author, whom he measured against the normative rabbinic writings. I have met Saltman once in Bar Ilan. He was a very charming polemicist who had a strong opinion about everything. And I like what he is writing, but I have some critiques on that. Using this he measured the author against the normative rabbinic writings. Using this standard, he repeatedly mocked the author's lack of education, such as the puerile level of his knowledge and his absurd and irresponsible exegesis, which was incompatible with, quote, accepted Jewish interpretations. Thus, he saw in the Hebrews a semi-educated convert who had become a monk and offered his services to Theodulf of Orleans for Bible revision in the time about 800, a charlatan through and through, who could so nimbly and undetected play the role of expert on all aspects of Hebraica Veritas. Quote Saltman, he alone knew how pitifully inadequate was his scholarly equipment, that he had to no written sources, that he had to rely on his already clouded memory of his elementary studies and his Jewish background. Of course, in his efforts, Saltman overlooked what Matianet had already noted in 1699, that the Jewish Western author of the 7th or 8th century, if he even drew on Hebrew biblical texts at all, would not have a Masoretic text at his disposal, and that in the days of Jerome, as Matianet says, the pronunciation of the Hebrew biblical reading, vocum Hebraicarum lectionem, differed from that which is customary among later Jewish and Hebrew grammarians. End quote, Matianet from the Latin. Consequently, as Matianet correctly concluded, the author could hardly be reached using the textual standards of Rabbinic Judaism. Furthermore, contrary to Saltman's assumptions, the author of the Questiones cannot be related to the Hebrew-speaking man or woman we know from the manuscripts of Theodulf of Orléans. This is the Psalter from one of the Theodulf Bibles in the Copenhagen manuscript, and a part from the Psalter which shows you at the left in the margins the age point for Hebreus, who proposed corrections to the Latin text of the Psalter in the version of the emendation of Theodulf. And you find it also here down to the right again and again proposals for correcting the Latin text by someone who was able to correct the Latin text, probably on the basis of a comparison with the Hebrew text, and suggesting corrections, alternations to the text, working with Theodulf in the time 800-810. But The manuscript from Verona, which Saltman didn't know, and I discovered it only by with from a small footnote from an 18th century printing that there is an awesome manuscript in Verona, and this turned out to be the oldest one we have, which is according to in the scripture probably the fourth quarter of the 8th century, if not earlier. Now, we could say, well, the assistant of Theodulf working in the time 800, 810, and this manuscript being a little bit older, last quarter of the 8th century, this could still be the same person writing the Questiones and helping Theodulf correcting the Bible. However, the text in the version of the Verona manuscript is already so much corrupted that there must be a couple of older layers, older generations of this text transmission up to the corruptive state of the Verona manuscript. So the Hebrews of Theodulf and the author of the Questiones they are not the same person as Saltman had suggested. Excuse me. I need to proceed, but I have 3 more pages, so then I hope this is okay for you. Admittedly, research has made significant leaps forward since Saltman first studied the Questiones and its authorship in the 70s of the last century. He apparently worked in Paris, made excursions to Orléans and Reims for checking the manuscripts, and traveled to St. Gall. However, he had no access to digitized catalogs or manuscript portals. The codices from Verona and Echternach relevant to the Corpus Genesis and text constitution were unknown to him. Even more significant is the impact of the research conducted in the interim with its many new perspectives. Static concepts of Judaism during the transition period between antiquity and the Middle Ages, while not yet universally accepted, have been replaced by more complex approaches that recognize distinct variations within Judaism in the transition period from antiquity to the Middle Ages. The reasons for this are manifold. I only mentioned the Qumran studies, the rise of pseudepigrapha research, and the adoption of literary methods to historiography have all contributed to this shift. Looking openly, and this is the part on old texts, new approaches, and different conclusions. Looking openly at the textual tradition, a number of other texts in Christian tradition can be identified as Jewish works, specifically those in Latin that, unlike Philo and Josephus, originated in the western part of the diaspora. They are all characterized by being written in Latin and transmitted in Christian scriptoria, yet containing no Christian content whatsoever. Besides the aforementioned Questiones, a number of other texts, likely by the same author or by the same school, have survived, including a commentary on the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, stylistically very similar to the Questiones. A related commentary on Habakkuk, printed only in part, but preserved in a few manuscripts with all 3 chapters of Habakkuk. A short piece on Zachariah entitled De Junius Disputatio, which deals with Jewish fast days. A text on the 10 temptations of Israel in the desert, and other short pieces such as a brief unprinted inventory of Jewish festivals, which only partially fits into the cycle of Jewish holidays known today. Furthermore, the Lex Dei, also known as the Collatio Legum Romanorum et Mosaicarum, a comparative legal collation of Roman and biblical provisions on criminal law, should be mentioned. Despite all efforts to the contrary, also the Lex Dei can hardly be meaningfully claimed as a text of Christian origin. Then there is the Epistola Annae ad Senecam, preserved in a single 9th century manuscript from Cologne Cathedral, and I unsubscribe to the interpretation of Bernard Bischoff that this is a text by a Jewish author. Besides these, in some cases, very small pieces in the series of Jewish Latin texts in Christian tradition, the opulent Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum by the so-called Pseudo-Philo must finally be mentioned. For decades, attempts have been made to ascribe a Hebrew original text and a Greek intermediate stage to this biblical narrative, which spans from Adam to the reign of Saul and is possibly preserved incompletely. Where all paleographical evidence for a Hebrew urtext is lacking, or for a Greek version, and textual critical arguments for precursors in other languages fall flat, it is best understood as a Jewish text originally written in Latin, probably in Rome, as Talleyrand has argued, or elsewhere in Italy. The earliest evidence of knowledge of the text comes from Fulda and Auxerre in the 9th century, while the oldest manuscripts from the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum come from Fulda, Trier, and the Salzburg-Bavarian region in the 11th and 12th century, respectively. Certainly, the tableau of Latin texts of Jewish origin, filtered through Christian tradition, as outlined here, appears decidedly heterogeneous, not to say disparate. Exegetical texts, prose, legal texts, parabiblical texts, a bit of everything, one might think. This seems inconsistent with the realities of everyday life and at first glance hardly justifies the concept of a corpus of Jewish texts from the pre-rabbinic period preserved in Christian tradition. But this impression can also be reversed, and one can argue that these are preserved spolia, fragments from a much broader and diverse spectrum of texts preserved on the ecclesiastical side, which, whatever the reasons for their preservation may have been, convey only a fragmentary idea of the intellectual world of Western Judaism and the diversity of its literary output in the centuries before the reception of rabbinic Judaism, meaning southern Italy probably in the 8th century, Spain even later, not to speak of the Ashkenazi Kernland north of the Alps. The question of how Christians dealt with texts of Jewish origin beyond their mere preservation is not easy to answer. Archibald and Hilduin in 829 and King Louis probably in 834 were instructed. Rabanus did not intend to impose the Hebrews' interpretation of the Book of Kings onto them, but rather to leave them their own judgment. Sed simpliciter ponens quod scriptum non quasi ingerens alicui auctoritatem ipsius, sed simpliciter ponens quod scriptum reperi eius probationem lectores judicio de relinquo. Readers in Saint-Denis and Reims were warned. They should read carefully, for the author might deviate from the church doctrine in some points. Hincmar of Reims found the collation of Jewish and Roman law in the Lex de useful for his tractate on Emperor Lothar's petition for divorce around 860 from Teutberger. Whether he was aware of the authorship is unclear. However, he cited his comparative legal collection with a peculiarly vague title as Primus Liber Legis Romanae, the first book of the Roman law. This sounds somewhat like the canonical forgeries of Pseudo-Isidore, and given the time, place, and persons involved, it fits all too well. If Hincmar was aware of the Jewish origin of the Lex De, it probably didn't bother him much. He appropriated the useful text parts from it the way that the statutes it contained could have an authoritative effect, but his origin was better left ambiguous. Philo, on the other hand, was beyond all doubt. Rabanus simply wrote, Philo autem in libro supradicto questionem suarum in Genesi narrat. Philo tells in his above-mentioned book on Genesis, etc., etc. The abbot of Fulda could not have known that he was quoting not from Philo, but from Pseudo-Philo's Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, and not from Philo's Questiones et Solutiones in Genesis. The almost undisputed authority of the Alexandrine philosopher ensured the acceptance of this remarkable work right up to the time of Nicolaus of Cusa in the 15th century. Heimer was also familiar with the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, but did not name its author, which is typical for this Carolingian free thinker. Similar traces of this can be found in the works of Remigius of Auxerre and Helinand of Froidemont. As we have seen, the filtering mechanisms worked admirably. Most manuscripts of the Questiones on the books of Kings lack any indication of their Jewish origin, as do the numerous quotations in the Glossa Ordinaria. The name of Jerome extended a protective cloak over this and other texts, ensuring their continued existence as Christian texts. But thus, in the end, we should consider the irony in the story that parts of Jewish texts written in Latin and protected by the name of Jerome made it into the Glossa Ordinaria, which became the standard tool of Christian exegesis throughout the Middle Ages. Thus, there has always been a considerable Jewish share in one of the core corpora of medieval Christianity. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hale, for this inspiring talk. And whoa, we are now open to questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand or send your question in the chat. Maybe I will start. I have a few, but I will start with just one brief question. You mentioned that you may have thought about the differences between Hebrew and Jew. So maybe you can say a few more words about it. I mean, I know that in patristic studies, Eusebius and also Origen already created the distinguish between the two terms. And from what I know, in Jerome, for example, he uses the two different terms very I don't know, frequently and without any specific aim. So maybe you have some thoughts that you would like to share.
For long, I didn't pay attention when I was studying these texts, paying attention to the fact that Rabanus is speaking about the Hebrews, but the manuscripts in Saint-Denis and Reims are speaking about the Judeus. But I think it's different from Jerome's use or the patristic nonchalance to mingle these terms, because in the moment when I'm sure that the author of the Questiones is a Jewish Latin writer. When he is speaking about the Hebrew, it becomes a different meaning. And this is what actually Rabanus did not transfer into his description, because he's quoting him as the Hebrews in his commentaries, like did the assistant of Theodulf. But there are instances in the text where he speaks about the eruditi illius linguae. So he speaks that he has learned from those who are experienced in the Hebrew language, and these people are the Hebrei for him. He doesn't speak about Christians. He does not name himself anything. But the Hebrei are the others. As long as I understand it in the sense of Hablitzel as a Christian author, it is not important. In the moment that I understand him again as a Jewish author, it's clear that he is struggling with upcoming Hebrew texts, people who have the advantage that they would not need to explain the Hebrew etymologies to their audience, because it's self-evident from the names itself. But most of his questiones refer to etymological questions, how to understand the names, what is their interior meaning. And I would place this text in difference to the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum or the Lex Dei, which I placed together with Talilan to the fourth, fifth century to Italy. I believe that the Questiones and the author or the group working up these texts we have in Migne 23 and in Migne are probably from the 7th or 8th century because we witness here the growing influence of Hebrew speakers of Rabbinic Judaism onto this Latin Western Jewish world. And this is the fascinating issue with the authorship of the Questiones, because we find this world in being in transition. And he is coping with that.
I see. I see. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. I see that. Oh, just thank you and people that needs to leave. Um, any other questions? Or maybe I should ask another one. I have a few. I would like to hear a bit if you have any thought about the differences maybe between Italy and other places in Europe. I mean, you at the beginning of your talk, you my impression was that you are focused on the North Africa and Italy with the archaeological evidences, and then the center of the text and the scriptoria and so on moved to Francia and beyond. Do you have any thoughts about the differences between the centers in early medieval Europe?
Perhaps we can explain it with the distinction of landscape. The Jewish landscape is Mediterranean. The Christian landscape has its centers uh, in the north, because even that we should locate the Jewish origin of the texts in Italy or even in North Africa, except of the Verona manuscript and the Monte Cassino manuscripts, there are three. There are no witnesses for the Questiones in Italy. For the Lex Dei, it's a little bit different. We have two Italian very important manuscripts, one in Vercelli and one from Verona, which is in Berlin. But let's say the reception of these texts happened in the north. And I would suggest that this has something to do with the transmission of books in the Carolingian area in the time of Charlemagne from the south to the north. So,
Mhm.
as they took everything what was useful for their purposes, to put it briefly, there were also some Jewish texts they took with them. And then they were copied in Fulda, in Reims, in Saint Denis. But there is no Spanish tradition of these texts because we grasp this text only in their Christian reception and not in their Jewish origins. A completely different project would be to take the corresponding parts from Rashi and what is normally considered to be non-midrashic material in Rashi, but Rashi's own opinion, in how far this is based still on an existing, on attainable tradition of Latin Jewish text in the workshop of Rashi. This would be a different project, but I think this is a question we could seriously address.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Thank you. Mo, please.
Well, thank you for the wonderful talk. I hope it's not like too basic of a question. I'm not familiar with the Jewish text. I was wondering though about the audience and about the reception. So if these texts are Jewish texts written in Latin, so was the audience Jewish? Was the audience Christian? Was the audience both? I mean, they didn't care about the religious identity of the readers. And the follow-up question would be, how were they read in the centuries that followed? Were they read again by Jewish people, Christian people, or again, the religious identity
Mhm.
was not
Yeah,
important?
yeah,
And if it
yeah,
wasn't important, so for what purpose were they being read, copied, and preserved?
yeah. So let's thank you more. Let's start from the end. The Jewish reception essentially ended with the 8th or 9th century. Maybe went up to, but this is only an idea, went up to the time of Rashi. But then these texts were sorted out from Jewish libraries because there was no need to preserve these non-Jewish, non-Hebrew texts. In the beginning, in the origin, it's hard to say because we have no Jewish witnesses for the use of those texts, let's say from Naro in Tunisia or from Rome, Ostia, in the 4th or 5th or 6th centuries. I could imagine that a text like the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum served the needs of a Jewish community or the communities in especially in the way the Liber is much shorter than the respective books of the Bible. So to have a comprehensive retelling of, interestingly, it's a quite different retelling, but this is another lecture. It's also very female telling of the biblical stories, and I call the author in the meantime pseudophila and not pseudophilo, because it seems to be a text written by, at least with participation of women. It's very different in that sense, but simply useful text for whatever purposes, because this is the other point. We have no idea about the liturgy in the synagogues of the West. There was an attempt to explain how Shabbat worked in the synagogue of Ostia. Excuse me, the directors, to be so direct, this is completely nonsense. Because already when you see the map of the synagogue, do you know a synagogue in the world where you enter from the east with the Arona Kodesh at your side and not from the west or from the side from the south or the north? No, they enter, and it's the same in Bova Marina and other places. They enter from the east and they have the ark here on the side, and so on and so on. So we don't know about the ritual practices of this non-rabbinic Judaism. And we should not transform our knowledge of late classical, early medieval rabbinic Jewish practices onto those non-rabbinic places. So I gave a long comment on your question, Mo, but I know I can't provide what you expect me to clarify. What is the Jewish audience? We can only make suggestions on that
Thank you.
to avoid wrong statements. That's the point.
Thank you. I have some questions from the chat, so maybe I will ask one. Is there any indication in this Latin text you have identified that any of them may have been authored by a Latin Christian who had converted to Judaism, like the famous and exceptional maybe case
Ovadia.
of Bodo Elazar? Yeah, right.
Ah,
Um,
okay. I thought about Ovadia.
oh, Obadiah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I wouldn't exclude it. But it's very there are only a few instances where you can touch the biography of the author of the questiones. And they don't probably tell the whole story. I would not exclude the possibility, but there is no hint to this in the text.
Okay, and we have another question. Do we know of Jewish communities that was Latin speaking and are they different from Hellenistic Judaism?
I would say Rome was kind of a melting point. You have even the catacombs on the Monte Verde are more Greek, and there are more Latin inscriptions in Torlonia and Vignarandanini, but the Greek speaking group is the bigger one in Rome. But when you go south to Tunisia, in the area of Carthago, when you have, and this is the inscriptions for North Africa are mostly overseen because they are only in a tentative edition by Jan Le Bohec available and not well documented. But they are, yeah, I would say something about 90% they are in Latin. So the other point is that we make clear divisions between Greek and Latin. But and this comes also again for the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, one of the arguments to say there must be a Hebrew urtext and a Greek intermediate version because of the many Hebraisms and Graecisms in the Latin text. But when you look onto these inscriptions, you find they are even changing the words, or even in the word, they have sometimes Greek and Latin letters together, and they are writing Greek words in Latin and Latin words in Greek. And with the Hebrew, the same happens. So they don't follow the clear rules of modern classical philology, but they are just speaking a hybrid, vivid language, which must be a horror to classicists.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another question. Did you find any Chazalic content in those Latin texts, or I mean, if you, I mean, contently or
I haven't understand what context Lalik?
Chazalic,
Ah,
like like rabbinic
Halachic.
stuff within,
Yeah.
rabbinic
Um,
notions of
yeah.
I don't know, of biblical exegesis or holidays and so on.
It's well, there is a sense of halacha in the lex day, but it's completely purely non-rabbinic.
Mhm.
They let's say they have more a Karaite attitude to practicing the penal law. But not in the sense we would understand halakha today. So the earliest clear influence of rabbinic Judaism, to the best of my knowledge, is a burial inscription in Venosa in the probably in the third quarter of the 8th century, with a clear Mishnah quotation. So then you see, okay, there it is. Yeah, so they have received this, and they are turning. There may be some of the benediction formulas in the inscription could be more in depth compared to practices in the East. But this is then also less my field, and I would discuss this with Leonard Rutgers or Willem van der Horst, and so they are much more versed in these issues. But as far as I can say, it's a different halacha, and it's a smaller halacha.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions? We have a follow-up question in the chat. Do we have estimations of by when these communities stopped using Latin?
I need to be careful. We have hints, documentation, since when they did not go on to copy Latin texts and writing in Latin. How long this text may have still been part of the libraries and people used it is an other question. And when you take the Chronicle of Yerachmeel, and this is the 12th century, you find the collator, compilator being able to read the Latin Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, because his Genesis story is not from the Bible, not from the Hebrew Bible, but he translates the Latin into the Hebrew and uses the Pseudo-Philo. So there were, even in the 12th century in Italy, well, and if you're living as a Jew, like in Italy or like Russia in France, and speaking a Roman language, by virtue they have access to Latin text, because the jump from Old French to Latin is not a big task. But they would not write in Latin. That's the point. Or let it put even differently, when you imagine a privilege by emperor, let's say from the Salian house, Henry IV, to Worms and Speyer, you feel there is much Jewish content in it. So there were discussions, there were negotiations about the content of the privilege, and all the time in advance until it was executed. But those Jews in Speyer and Worms needed to know Latin in able to control if the content as negotiated is really written in the official version. So only some thoughts about, yeah, but they never would again write in Latin. That's the point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Or seems like that's it. So let us thank Professor Heil once more for this illuminating talk. Oh, would you like to say something? Yeah.
Before you before your kind farewell, just a hint to the book you mentioned and I referred to in German, but just appeared a few days ago, a volume edited by Franz von Lire on shared scripture, divided faith, and there I have kind of a summary in English, which will be available within the next weeks. This, not that I'm a selling agent, but simply when you would like to read more, but not in German, but in English. So there will be a few articles in the next future taking different aspects of that German book into English texts.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you all for the question and for your participation. And we will meet again on May 27th, yeah, for the talk by Professor Magali Kumer. A recording will be available soon on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. And in the meantime, wishing you all happy spring holidays, Pesach Kasher V'Sameach, and happy Easter. And thank you again, Professor Heil.
Thank you for your patience, and thank to all the audience, and thank you for organizing. I see Rodrigo from Buenos Aires is also here. Wonderful. So I'm grateful for this international group meeting today, and during difficult times in Israel. So My kind regards to all in Israel. Stand fast, and for all your friends and the families.
Thank you.
Okay. So Pesach Sameach, Happy Easter, and peaceful time to come.
Amen for that. Thank you so much. And Mo, stay safe, and Itzik and all the other people in Israel.
אוקיי, כל טוב שחר בשביל המשפחה.
שחר, להתראות.
תודה רבה. ביי.
ביי.
ביי ביי, להתראות.